What happens when AI and blockchain strip away the middlemen? The media gatekeepers are gone. Now media gets personal, power shifts to creators, and the game changes forever. This is disintermediation, and it's a total AI dope move.
We're taking a deep dive today into the future of media, how things might look 5-10 years down the line. You know, you gave me some really interesting articles to read by this media analyst, Doug Shapiro.
Yeah, Shapiro. He's got this central question that just grabs you.
Yeah.
Like, okay, we're in a world just saturated with media.
Yeah.
But the media pie, the overall consumption, it's not growing that much anymore. So how does that pie, how does it get divided?
Yeah.
How's it sliced up? And that's what he dives into. He goes into these big concepts: fragmentation, disintermediation, concentration, and he even gets into virtualization.
You know, it's interesting. He talks about this media big bang when things went digital.
Yeah.
And he points to digitization as being the catalyst for this explosion of content and how it's all changed.
Yeah, he talks about how digitization basically created this universal language, a language of bits. So now information can flow across any platform or device. And he makes the point that that flow has led to just an explosion of content.
Yeah. He has some really big numbers that'll make your head spin. 11 million artists on Spotify, over 14,000 new games every year on Steam.
Wow.
Twice as many original TV series as we had just 10 years ago.
It's just incredible. But he doesn't just stop at kind of pointing out the problem, right? He actually digs into the why behind all this. And one of the big things he brings up is the lowering of barriers to entry.
Right. Production is easier, marketing is easier, distribution, monetization, it's all become much more accessible.
Yeah, and he also talks about how this has really changed our definition, or the consumer's definition, of what quality is. And I love the analogy he uses. He compares it to hotels versus Airbnb. So, what used to be considered a luxury hotel, what attributes made that up,
Right.
are now evolving. And things like location and having a kitchen, that Airbnb brought to the table.
It's almost like Airbnb introduced new values to what people were looking for.
Exactly. And so he's saying the same thing's happening in media. Like, those old measures of quality aren't necessarily what matters most anymore. Yeah, things like authenticity or the sense of community around a piece of content, those are starting to play a much bigger role.
Yeah.
And you can actually see that fragmentation playing out within media categories themselves. Nielsen data shows that streaming share of TV viewing has almost doubled in just the last 4 years. Quick ask. Almost 95% of you watch our videos but still aren't subscribed. Please click subscribe. It really helps us grow. And if you're not loving our content, you can always change your mind. Thanks, and back to it.
And what about short-form video? Activate reports that it now makes up 25% of all video viewing for adults. And that doesn't even factor in kids.
Kids, yeah. And Gallup research shows teens are spending close to 5 hours a day on social media. And video is just eating up all that time. I mean, you can almost say that this generation, they're growing up with a completely different relationship to media.
Yeah, so let's switch gears a little bit and talk about disintermediation. And Shapiro really makes the argument that technology is empowering creators to kind of go around those traditional gatekeepers.
Right. He describes it as the classic media value chain. You have creators, publishers, producers, aggregators, distributors, and then finally the consumer. But tech, it's really shaking up that chain at its very core.
We see it everywhere. Musicians are battling for ownership rights.
Absolutely. Journalists launching their own Substacks, game developers selling directly to consumers. It's a real power shift.
Yeah, and he makes a great point that although those traditional intermediaries, they still hold valuable assets.
Sure, they still have a lot of IP, and they definitely have the marketing muscle.
Right.
But they are facing an uphill battle, there's no doubt about it.
Hey, want our free AI dope top AI tools that we use? Chat below. It's our live Google Sheets packed with over 100 killer tools: video, music, photos, AI voices, productivity, script writing, YouTube hacks, captions, the works. Always growing. Live Google Sheet. Always free. AI, dope top AI tools that we use. Download and chat below. Back to the show.
So this brings us to what I think is one of the most impactful forces he talks about, this idea of concentration. And, Shapiro really emphasizes these network effects that have emerged with digital media and how they often create these winner-take-all scenarios.
He talks about platforms like Facebook and how their power is really in how interconnected the users are. And it's that connection, that being able to connect with other people, that's where the value comes from.
So the more people that are on the platform.
Exactly. The more valuable the platform becomes for everyone else who's on it. So it's this self-perpetuating cycle.
Yeah.
So you get this positive feedback loop that leads to a few key platforms dominating. And they just have unprecedented scale and resources.
He called them the new gatekeepers, right? You know, you've got Facebook, YouTube, Netflix. These are the forces to be reckoned with.
He compares their market caps to those of traditional media companies. And it really puts it in perspective how big they are, how much influence they have.
Yeah, he mentions that even the smallest of these platforms, Meta, has a market cap that's roughly equal to the entire global media industry combined.
It's mind-blowing when you think about it.
It is. It really makes you wonder, how can traditional media companies even compete with that?
Right. And it's not just their size. He points out that even though they're gatekeepers, they operate so differently from the old guard.
Yeah, so for example, traditional studios have this really tight control over the content they produce. But these platforms, they thrive on permissionless uploads.
Right.
Anybody can upload pretty much anything.
Anyone, yeah. And then instead of relying on executives to decide what's good and what's not, platforms just use algorithms. They use algorithms to surface content, to pick what we see.
Right.
And that's all based on our behavior, our preferences.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder, is there anything that can challenge this concentration of power?
He does mention a few things. He brings up regulation as one possibility, but those network effects we talked about, they're a huge hurdle for regulators to overcome.
Yeah. What else does he say?
He talks about crypto networks, how their decentralized nature could maybe disrupt the dominance of these big centralized platforms. It's a really compelling idea.
Okay.
And then he even mentions this idea of AI agents acting as intermediaries, like these personalized media curators. Imagine an AI agent just sifting through all the noise, curating content from all these different platforms just for you, based on your tastes. It's a fascinating, if uncertain, future.
Now, even with all this infinite content, Shapiro says that hits still emerge. He talks about this power law effect, where popularity is driven by information and these reputational cascades.
Basically, it's like people gravitate toward what's already popular. They see it as a sign of quality, or maybe they just want to be in on the conversation.
Yeah, and the more popular something gets, the more attention it receives, and that just keeps amplifying its popularity. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
And he backs it up with some pretty amazing statistics. He shows how this skewed distribution of popularity plays out across every type of media. Box office numbers, Netflix demand, Spotify streams, even Patreon patronage. We're living in this long tail world where the head of that tail is just incredibly heavy.
Yeah, it does make you wonder if it's getting harder and harder for creators to break through that noise and get noticed.
He argues that those power laws have some pretty big implications, not just for individual creators, but for the whole media landscape.
So what are some of the biggest implications?
Well, for one, the bargaining power really shifts towards those hit makers. They hold all the cards when it comes to negotiations. And then, because there's such a difference in outcomes, the risks associated with creating content are also amplified. So it's a real high-stakes game.
Yeah. He also talks about the role of luck in success.
Luck becomes even more important. You could have a fantastic product, but without that viral boost, that lucky break, it might never find its audience.
It makes you wonder if a middle class of creators can even exist in an environment like that. It seems like it's either boom or bust.
It does raise that question.
So this last trend he brings up, virtualization. This is where things start to get really interesting and maybe a bit more optimistic.
He really believes virtualization has the power to expand the media pie. Not by just creating more content, but by creating entirely new ways to consume it.
It feels like we're just on the cusp of something really transformative here.
It does. It does. Let's start with the Apple Vision Pro. He really thinks that its extended reality capabilities, its XR, it could be a game changer for media consumption.
I mean, imagine watching a movie, but instead of just sitting there, you could experience it from any point of view you want.
You could be right in the middle of the action.
Right in the middle of the action.
Yeah.
So what else? What are some of the other ways virtualization could shake things up?
Virtual worlds like Roblox and Fortnite,
Okay.
they're already blurring those lines between gaming and social interaction, and they're bringing in millions and millions of users.
And, you know, we can't forget about Disney and their big investment in Epic Games. I mean, that seems like a pretty clear signal that these traditional media giants, they're looking to carve out their space in these virtual environments.
No doubt about it. Shapiro also talks about this exciting possibility of fan creation and ownership. He thinks fans are eager to create, and that models like NFTs could be the key to unlocking that potential.
It's about giving fans a stake in the content they love, rather than just passively consuming it.
Right. And it could lead to a level of engagement and community that we've never seen before.
So last thing, he touches on AI and autonomous vehicles, how those could potentially boost our media consumption time.
Yeah, AI could lead to some big gains in productivity. More free time. Imagine having more hours in the day to spend exploring all these new forms of media.
And those daily commutes, they could be completely transformed into prime media time thanks to self-driving cars. That's a big change in how and when we engage with content.
It is. But you know, even though he's optimistic about these possibilities, he also acknowledges that they're still years away and their ultimate impact is still uncertain.
It's definitely a future full of potential, but it's also one that's going to require a lot of careful thought and strategic navigation.
Absolutely.
Okay, welcome back. We're continuing our deep dive here. We're really trying to unpack some of these massive trends that are going to shape the media world over the next, well, who knows how long, really. But, in the coming years.
We've been following Doug Shapiro's thinking, right? This media analyst. He offers some really compelling ways to think about this shifting media landscape.
One thing that really stood out to me from the last part, and as I was reading through these articles, is, he makes this point that even though there's just this explosion of content, more content than ever, he says the overall media pie isn't actually expanding that much.
Yeah, that's a huge point. It's not that people aren't consuming media. It's that they've reached this point where they're kind of maxed out.
Right.
Saturation point.
So people aren't going to magically start consuming more and more media. So for the media industry to grow, it seems like we either need some really fundamental change in how people consume media, or people have to be willing to pay a lot more.
That's the reality. It's not just about producing more and more content.
Right.
It's about finding these new ways to engage with audiences and capture their attention and, yeah, maybe even their wallets.
Yeah. So he's saying it's not just about volume anymore. It's about value.
Right.
Finding those new ways to create value.
Exactly. Shapiro does talk about some reasons to be optimistic, particularly with virtualization, which we'll dig into later. But right now, you got to face the facts, right? We're dealing with a pretty mature industry, and the big question is, how does value shift within that system?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's where I think his this media theory of everything that he talks about comes into play. He's trying to make sense of all this complexity, right?
Right, and he proposes these 4 core trends that he thinks are really key for explaining and predicting what's going to happen. Fragmentation, disintermediation, concentration, and virtualization. So these 4 trends, they're kind of like a framework for decoding the big changes that are happening right now.
Yeah, so we've already touched upon fragmentation and disintermediation.
Yeah.
Let's focus on this idea of concentration for a little bit. Shapiro really emphasizes these network effects that have emerged with this rise of digital media consumption.
Think about platforms like Facebook, right? The strength of those platforms, it's all about the connections between users.
Right.
That's where the value comes from. We derive value from connecting with other people.
So the more people on the platform, the more valuable it becomes for everyone. It's kind of this cycle of growth.
Exactly. It's like a self-perpetuating cycle. It creates this positive feedback loop, and that's why you end up with just a few key platforms dominating, and they have massive scale. Tons of resources. It's crazy.
And that's why he calls them the new gatekeepers, right?
Yes.
Facebook, YouTube, Netflix, they're the ones to watch.
He even compares their market caps to traditional media companies. It's wild to see that comparison, just to really grasp their size and influence.
Yeah. He mentions that even the smallest of these platforms, Meta, their market cap is pretty much equal to the entire global media industry, all combined.
It's mind-boggling.
It really is. It makes you wonder, can the traditional media companies even compete with that? Can they even keep up?
And it's not just their size. Shapiro points out that these platforms, even though they are gatekeepers, they operate so differently than the traditional intermediaries.
In what ways?
Think about content curation. Traditional studios, they really control what gets produced. They're very selective.
Right.
But these platforms, they often rely on algorithms. to surface content.
Yeah.
They use algorithms to decide what we see based on our behavior and our preferences.
Yeah, and I guess that also allows them to take on less financial risk because the creators are often the ones bearing the burden of production and marketing.
Right. Much leaner model.
So does Shapiro talk about any challenges to this concentration of power? I mean, it seems like they're just getting bigger and bigger.
He does, yeah. He talks about regulation as one possibility. But those network effects that we talked about, those are a huge hurdle to overcome for regulators.
Okay, so what else does he bring up?
Crypto networks. That's interesting. Their decentralized nature could maybe disrupt the dominance of these big centralized platforms.
Yeah, that's definitely an intriguing possibility.
And then he even mentions AI agents as intermediaries.
Oh, wow.
It's like these personalized media curators. You know, imagine having an AI agent that just sifts through all the noise, curates content from every platform based on your unique tastes.
Yeah, that would be a game changer.
You would.
You know, that brings us back to this whole concept of power laws. Because even with all this infinite content, Shapiro argues that hits still emerge, like they defy the odds.
It's because of information cascades, reputational cascades. Basically, people, they tend to gravitate toward things that are already popular.
Right.
It's a sign of quality, they think. Or maybe they just want to be part of the conversation.
Yeah.
And that creates this self-fulfilling prophecy. The more popular something gets, the more attention it gets, which then amplifies its popularity even more.
Yeah, it's like a runaway train.
And he uses some really interesting real-world examples to show this. How this distribution of popularity, this skewed distribution, it's everywhere. Box office numbers, Netflix demand, Spotify streams, even Patreon. You know, we're living in this long tail world where the head of that tail is just super heavy.
Yeah, it does make you wonder how hard it is for creators to break through.
He also says those power laws, they have big consequences for everyone, for the whole media landscape.
Okay, so break that down for me. Like, what are some of those consequences? What are we talking about here?
Well, bargaining power.
Yeah.
It shifts to those hit makers. They have all the leverage in negotiations.
Right.
And the role of luck. It gets amplified. You can have an amazing product, but without that viral moment, that lucky break, it might never find an audience.
It makes you wonder, can a middle class of creators even exist in this world?
It's a tough question. It does seem like the middle ground is shrinking. It's either a massive hit or you're struggling.
Yeah, and those risks, they get bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
Because the variance in outcomes is so high.
Right. Shapiro even suggests that the middle of that curve might get hollowed out completely. All the attention and resources flow to those massive hits.
That's a pretty sobering thought.
Yeah.
So let's move on to this final trend, virtualization. This is where things get really interesting and maybe a little more optimistic.
Virtualization, it's all about expanding that media pie, not just by creating more content, but by creating new ways to experience it.
Yeah.
Consume it, new ways to interact with it. It feels like we're on the verge of something really transformative here.
Yeah, it does feel that way.
So the Apple Vision Pro, great place to start. Shapiro sees its extended reality capabilities, that XR, as a potential game changer.
I mean, imagine watching a movie, but not just watching it. You could experience it from any viewpoint within the scene.
Right, like you're actually there in the middle of the action.
It's wild to think about. So what else is out there in this virtualization space?
Virtual worlds, like Roblox, Fortnite, they're already doing this. They're blurring the lines between gaming and social interaction, and millions of people are using them.
And then you've got Disney and their investment in Epic Games.
Big move.
I mean, that really signals that these traditional media companies they're taking this trend seriously.
No question.
They want in.
And Shapiro also talks about fan creation and ownership. He says fans are eager to create, and models like NFTs, they could be the key to unlocking that potential.
Yeah, I mean, and with self-driving cars, your commute, it just becomes prime media consumption time. I mean, that's a big shift in how and when we engage with media.
It is. But, Shapiro acknowledges even though these things are exciting, they're still years away. We don't really know what the impact is going to be.
It's a future with a lot of potential, but it's also one that's going to require a lot of careful consideration.
And some strategic thinking about how to navigate it.
All right, welcome back to the Deep Dive. So we've spent the last two parts really digging into these four big trends that Doug Shapiro lays out: fragmentation, disintermediation, concentration, and virtualization.
Right, and now it's time to like connect the dots, see what it all means.
Exactly. So how does this media landscape, how does it impact creators, those traditional media companies, these new platform giants, and of course us, the consumers? How's this all going to shake out?
Okay, well let's start with the creators. And I think it's a mixed bag for them. It's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, the barriers to entry have never been lower. I mean, anyone with a smartphone can be a creator.
True.
But that also means more competition than ever. Way more. And with those power law dynamics, it's tough.
Yeah.
A tiny fraction of creators, they end up grabbing most of the attention, most of the rewards.
So you're saying it's the ones with huge followings, the ones who get lucky, they're the ones that see the big success.
Exactly.
So what does that mean for creators who aren't already established names? Like what's their path forward?
Shapiro suggests instead of chasing like mainstream success, they should really focus on building a dedicated audience,
Yeah.
even if it's smaller. It's about finding your niche and figuring out how to make it work financially.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So how about traditional media companies? Honestly, it doesn't sound very optimistic for them.
It's tough. I mean, their viewership's declining, their bargaining power is shrinking, and they're facing these like behemoth platform companies with totally different business models and tons of resources.
So is it game over for them? I mean, are they doomed?
It's not quite that dire. Shapiro points out that they still have valuable IP, established brands, and in some cases, a lot of data about their audiences.
So there's hope.
There's hope, but they need to adapt, maybe embrace smaller, more niche businesses. And, that can be a tough pill to swallow for companies used to operating on a massive scale.
Okay, so let's talk about those new intermediaries, those platform giants. They're in a pretty good spot, right?
They're the ones controlling the networks, and those network effects, that's a massive competitive advantage.
Plus, they have all that data.
Right.
They know so much about their users, and they're using it.
Yeah, for ad targeting, content recommendations, even product development. But Shapiro throws in this interesting twist. He says, even though these platforms are dominant, the actual prize might not be as big as it seems.
So their media dominance doesn't necessarily mean they're going to rake in the cash.
Well, that's what he argues. The media industry, even with all its potential for growth, it's still relatively small compared to like the revenue streams of these tech giants.
Okay, last but not least, us, the consumers. On the surface, it looks good. More choices, lower prices.
Yeah, there's a paradox there, though. Too much choice can lead to decision fatigue, and you might actually be less satisfied with your choices.
I've heard that called the paradox of choice, right? More isn't always better.
Exactly. And, as traditional media companies struggle, we might actually see a decline in content quality, at least by the old standards of quality.
So where does all this leave us? I mean, it's clear the media world's changing fast, and Shapiro's analysis gives us a good way to understand what's happening.
Yeah, whether you're a creator, a media executive, or just a consumer trying to keep up with it all, you gotta be aware of these forces.
What about the future of AI in filmmaking? Click this next video to find out how the massive disruption of Hollywood due to AI is already taking place right now.